Hello and welcome back to our discussion of the philosophy of love and friendship. Today we are doing some more context work by talking about the medieval world and about Islam in particular. Usually when you talk about the medieval world, you'll find that there's not actually a whole lot to talk about. People like to call this the Dark Ages, which is, pretty misleading, as we'll talk about in a moment. But frequently when you talk through history books or when you take a course in Western Civ, you'll spend, honestly, a very little amount of time talking about the Middle Ages, everything between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance in the 16th or 15th century. Even if you look at this timeline that I've got up here, it very much has a lot to do with everything leading up to the fall of Rome, everything that we talked about earlier with, especially Constantine coming to power, the divided empire, all that fun stuff, before we even get to, actual medieval stuff happening. And then by the time that you see all the, important dates, it's already the 14th century, and we've, missed practically, 1,000 years here. And I want to stress, this is itself kind of bad historiography on some respects. The story that once upon a time there were the Greeks, and then there were the Romans, and they were awesome, and then things got bad for 1,000 years, and then the Renaissance saved us from our own stupidity. This is a version of history that you're probably pretty familiar with at this point. I imagine that everything that happened during the medieval period is a blur, if that, and if you, are completely unsure of the difference between the Renaissance and, say, the high medieval era, or the Norman conquest, or any of the fun stuff going on here, even on this timeline, that's probably a consequence of, again, many historians and many thinkers and many people trying to represent Western civilization kind of giving you a bad story. And the truth of the matter is, we don't like to talk about the medieval era all that much, because it's not really all that flattering to we Westerners. When you talk about the medieval world, it's usually pretty limited to, France, Spain, Germany, England, and that's it. As though the rest of the world just sort of, knocked off for lunch, and, while Europe was having a really rough time of it, they presumably were off, playing Parcheesi and waiting for us to catch up or something. This is not at all true. Honestly, part of the reason why people don't talk about the Middle Ages in Western Civ classes is because Europe was kind of having a rough time while the rest of the world was doing just fine, thank you very much. In fact, it's places like the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world that are enjoying a golden age during this very era. And as I've said before and will say again, as far as we're concerned in this class, all of that is Western culture. Islam, the Byzantines, the Orthodox Church instead of the Roman Catholic Church, all of that is relevant to our discussion, and we are going to sample all of that. We will be sampling less and less of it as time goes on, and, Europe really does start to flourish and create its own sort of philosophical legacy, which we can investigate in some significant detail. But for now, what I want to emphasize is, looking at the medieval world, we're going to look at all sides of the medieval world. Everything that came out of the Greek heritage, everything that came out of the Roman Empire, all of that is fair game to us. Not just Christendom, not just Roman Catholicism, not just Europe, in some sense. So if the first story you've heard is, the medieval world was the Dark Ages and, nothing interesting happened, but fortunately the Renaissance saved us from all of this, the rest of this PowerPoint presentation is the competing story, the second story you need to know for this class. Most of the time when I try and present these two stories, I'm going to try and present them in a way that's even-handed. There's one, there are two different ways of looking at it. Here, there is a right way and a wrong way. But, as we'll talk about in some detail as we go along, that is not the end of the conversation here. If the emphasis of the historiography dimension of this class is that, you need to learn to look at history from many different perspectives and worldviews, yeah, shocker, we're going to be looking at all of these cultures from multiple perspectives and worldviews. This is going to get complicated, folks, but that's a good thing. Because, again, this is oversimplified more often than not. And there's honestly a lot of study that we could do to any one of the topics we're about to bring up in this medieval world. keep in mind that the fact that we are only spending a week on it doesn't mean that it isn't important, just that it is relatively unimportant compared to all the other stuff that we're going to be talking about further on during the semester. And I should stress, the fact that we are not dedicating the appropriate amount of time and effort to studying this period is not an indication that I don't think it's worth studying. Just that this is an intro class, we have a lot to cover, and blowing through the medieval era is unfortunately only going to take us about a week and a half when all is said and done. Sorry, folks. So that said, I want to kick off our discussion of the medieval world as it's appropriately supposed to be understood by picking up right where we left off. So last time we were talking about Rome, we were talking about Stoicism, we were talking about the Roman Empire, and as we were talking about sort of the rise of Christendom and, Constantine coming to power, we kind of left Rome split in half, with the western half of the empire being the crappy half, even though, it is where Rome is, and supposedly this was the big power center of the entire Mediterranean world for like 500 years, and the eastern half, which at this point is thoroughly Christian, because much of Christendom sort of spread out of Jerusalem and through Asia Minor and Greece especially, even though the Roman Church is kind of powerful in its own right. The Eastern Church is wealthy, the Eastern Church is culturally significant. It is much more the better part of the empire at this particular point in time. And then as we left off in our last PowerPoint presentation, Rome actually had fallen. Like, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths were knocking on their doors. Finally, they took over the place, broke the Roman power structure that existed in Rome. Now, the Roman power structure in Constantinople is pretty much all that exists of the old school Roman Empire as we were talking about it last time. And I want to stress that this is the first of our three sort of vying political entities that we're going to be talking about for, the medieval world and through much of Western history. This is the origin of the Byzantine Empire. Remember, Rome still exists in Constantinople. Remember that, the head Caesar was residing in Constantinople for the better part of several hundred years. Not several hundred, but at least 150 before Rome properly fell. And as much as the barbarian invaders from the east and north had basically taken over Italy and Rome, Constantinople was protected and not threatened. That was where the military had been focused, that's where the bureaucracy had been concentrating, that's where the empire was protected. And consequently, when Attila the Hun and company came rushing through, they left Constantinople alone. It was too well defended, and these, invaders did not pose a threat to the Eastern Roman power. But that said, this Eastern Roman Empire was cut off from the rest of the empire. Rome itself was out of their reach for most of the Byzantine Empire's history. Now, the Byzantines are kind of not the most important participant in our discussion today, despite being the most obvious link to the past that we've looked at. At its peak, the Byzantines actually get pretty close to controlling everything that Rome had once controlled back in, the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. But this is very short-lived. The emperor who's kind of in charge at this point is the Emperor Justinian. We'll be talking about him again. And in the 6th century, he kind of just runs the Byzantine show. His adversaries in Persia and among the Arab nations really haven't gotten their shit together yet. So the Byzantines are able to basically just, run the table around the Mediterranean Sea. Justinian, basically mounts a couple of major military expeditions to take Rome back from the Gothic tribes, and he is successful, but it really only stays in his hands for maybe 20, 30 years before it's reconquered and the whole system kind of starts up all over again. But the Byzantines have a distinct culture, separate from the Romans as we had understood them. As much as they are, for the purposes of history, kind of a logical continuation of the Roman Empire, even down to the succession of the emperors, it isn't the same empire that we have come to be familiar with. The Byzantines are a thoroughly Christianized people. As much as, Christianity and, the Roman secular power in Rome had kind of an uneasy alliance through the last couple hundred years of its existence, the Byzantines are basically founded by Constantine and therefore have Christianity in mind as the empire is growing. But what's interesting is that as much as this is a Christianized empire, it is kind of the mirror opposite of what's going on in Europe at the time. That while the church in Rome is gradually becoming the greatest power structure with, like any secular authorities sort of paying homage to that church, the church in the East, the church in the Byzantine Empire, the Orthodox Church as it will come to be known, is very much sort of an arm of the Constantinople secular power structure, the Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire as we understand it. So Christianity is very important, but it is also a political tool of the emperor. He gets along with the patriarchs and sort of frequently bends them to their will instead of the Christian authorities like the Pope basically telling the kings and Visigothic emperors what to do. So the Byzantines are piously Christian, is what I want to emphasize, to the point that it influences every aspect of Byzantine culture. Like if you wander over to the Metropolitan Museum of Art at some point in the near future, one of my favorite places to stop is the Byzantine wing, which is sort of connected to, like, simultaneously the medieval and the Roman Empire and Greek ancient displays. And you'll find a bunch of mosaics and like tapestries with these kinds of designs on them, these intricate, complicated little designs which are very much associated with the Byzantine Empire. And I want to stress, these are typically not very representational. Like, you'll occasionally find images of animals, maybe a human here or there, but most of them are just like geometric patterns, these designs that sort of like catch the eye and cause it to sort of like wander and try and untangle what's going on here. This was actually a deliberately Christian choice on the part of the Byzantines. Like following the fairly restrictive laws in the Old and New Testament about like not representing God and, not representing like images for you to, pick up and worship. The Byzantines figured, hey, we're going to make these elaborate designs and they'll cause you to like sit and look at them and think about them without actually being tempted to lust or to other kinds of sin. So again, I want to stress, the idea here is this is a Roman power structure understood through a Christian lens. Like, how do we do all of the power, all of the grandeur, all of the secular authority that the great emperors have wielded for many years, while not claiming to be some kind of divine entity or the son of God, as the way that Augustus did, but rather recognize them oneself as being sort of subordinate to Christian authority and, Christian teaching. And one of the ways that Justinian in particular solves this is he manages to kind of like build his own law on the skeleton of the Roman legal system that had existed in the past. Like, between the fall of Roman Empire and, like, the civil wars that had taken place and just different emperors having different policies, Roman law was kind of a mess at this point. So Justinian got all of his, legal scholars and philosophers together in the 6th century and basically said, okay, we're going to standardize all of this. And the Justinian Code is a truly impressive work of legal engineering, so to speak, to the point that it is kind of the basis for just about every European code of law today and beyond. Like, you can find sort of, like, homage and allusions to the Justinian Code in almost every contemporary government in the Western world and beyond. Like, Islam borrowed from it liberally, like all of the European legal codes borrow from it liberally. It's just all over the place. Like, you will find its ideas peppered throughout basically every legal code, in, like, west of India, if not beyond. And I want to stress that because we have this one solid code, we actually get a pretty good idea of what the laws are, considering, especially women's sexuality, all the things that we've sort of been focusing on in our class up to this point. It's not a perfect image because a lot of the laws are sort of, one thing on paper and another thing when they're actually enforced and discussed. But we do get this image that, like, the Justinian Code is actually rather more restrictive, especially towards women, than what we saw with the last stages of the Roman Code. The Sina Manus Code, where you don't need guardianship or don't need, to be under the hand of your father or husband. So you'll notice that here in the Justinian Code, in order to get married, you got to get both parents behind it. Not the kids, the parents. Like, the husband and wife are sort of secondary here. Where the Sine Manus Code very much insisted that you needed the consent of both, like, the husband and wife in order to get married, which is kind of assumed here, but is not explicit significantly. Here it says, hey, you got to get the parents on board. So now the parents, once again, have a lot of say over who is getting married here. Like, they were largely excluded from the latter stages of the Roman Code. Here they are brought back into the fold. So once again, if two people are in love, they're not just going to be able to hook up and, get married willy-nilly. Likewise, you'll notice that divorce is out. We're following Christian law here, and there are many, many restrictions in the Old and New Testament against divorce. It is considered to be a failure to live up to God's standards. So consequently, Justinian allows for some divorce, but only under extreme cases. If one or the other has committed adultery, if one or the other is guilty of murder, these are some of the very few circumstances where a divorce can be properly applied. So under the Sine Manus Code of like the late Roman Empire, everyone was getting divorced whenever they wanted to. Nobody cared. It was just like, you get married, you get divorced, you get married again. Like, this was part of why everyone was so suspicious of the Roman Empire. Like, historians later were like, oh, this contributed to the downfall of the Roman Empire, this moral depravity. Justinian is correcting this, or perceives himself as correcting this. But I want to stress, as weird as this is, like, the laws concerning divorce are actually pretty deeply connected to feminism here. And you'll notice that this means we've got a much higher view of marriage and a much more constrained ability to, get married and get divorced. This means that you're probably looking at a worldview where women are getting married without their consent at a very young age and kind of being stuck in those situations, despite, like, the best efforts of everyone around you. Women are being disempowered here, in short. Now, that said, Justinian says he will give divorces to men and women equally. The Justinian Code lays out that it's like, if either person gets or commits adultery, then the divorce can be made manifest, which is an apparent concession to, the Roman equality laws, the fact that either person could apply for a marriage. Like, a woman was not ruled by her husband, they were effectively equals. But notice that in practice, this is not really all that powerful, because as much as divorces are granted to women in theory, women aren't actually allowed to bring accusations against their husbands without, like, serious evidence from other sources. Like, alone, women have very little legal power here. So consequently, this is like an equality without any force. Sure, women can get divorces if their husbands cheat on them, but the only way that a woman can accuse her husband of cheating on her is if she's got a man backing her up. So, oops, guess that's not really equal at all. Now, that said, historically, it looks like, as much as the Justinian Code and other sources seem to discourage women from engaging in public life, from, having economic independence, having political independence, the actual evidence is kind of opposite that. There are a lot of very successful women and fairly independent women under the Justinian Code. Like, Justinian's wife herself is really powerful and influential. Theodora is one of the great women of the medieval world in many ways. So as much as, again, the Justinian Code gives us a pretty solid picture of what the laws look like because they are codified, because they are duplicated, because they are enforced throughout the empire, it's definitely not sure how much of these laws are actually being enforced. Like, as much as there is a giant book that says this is what's supposed to be going down, it looks like women are enjoying a lot more power and freedom than is actually the case. Likewise, there is an institution that is very much discussed among contemporary scholars today, this idea of spiritual brotherhood, which has foundations in both Orthodox and Catholic traditions, but is something that is sort of more frequently occurring among the Byzantines and especially among, like, the Orthodox Church. This, like, depending on who you talk to, this seems to be a kind of, like, serious, real deal friendship on the order of, like, Aristotle talking about friendships of virtue, where, these two people are going to spend their lives together and, there's this intimate bond between them and they're going to, like, pursue virtue and, applying this to Christianity, pursue holiness together. what I want to stress is that this is, in fact, an actual ceremony, like on par with the marriage ceremony. Like, to be spiritual brothers is to undergo this fairly involved ceremonial procedure and, to exchange crosses and be recognized as effectively brothers going forward. Some contemporary scholars, including this guy, John Boswell, who is, if I'm not mistaken, a Yale scholar in the 1970s and 80s and kind of a gay rights advocate in many ways. He wrote this really impressive book and a series of books afterwards where he, sort of talked about Christianity in the medieval world, and many of these books are extremely controversial, but also really interesting to study and look at. Boswell argued that spiritual brotherhood was essentially like the Orthodox Church giving a stamp of approval to what was basically gay marriage. That these spiritual brothers had a sexual component that everyone was just kind of on board with. But I want to stress that most Orthodox authorities today are like, nope, that's totally not what that was, and you're clearly taking this ceremony completely out of context, and you're misinterpreting it for your own political agenda. All that to say, much of our discussion of the medieval world is going to basically circulate around a lack of information. Foucault talks about this, Boswell talks about this, we will get into this later on in the semester, but it is especially relevant now, based on all of the times that I'm going to say things like, this is what the law says, but it seems like in practice something else was going on. It seems like there is a series of questions surrounding the medievals and their conduct that basically come down to, how do we interpret their silence? Like, since no one is talking about sex in, peasant life, does that mean that it's tolerated? That, like, we're fine with there being gay people running around and there are actually homosexual communities all throughout the medieval world? Or is it being suppressed and any discussion of it is not acceptable, and therefore, like, there's actually all of these forces at work preventing these things from happening? Because I want to stress, different people interpret this a different way. Folks like Boswell think that the silence of, various authorities is an indication that, hey, yeah, spiritual brothers are actually, sexually active homosexual relationships, and everyone's just on board with this, and the medieval world doesn't care to oppress or suppress or oppose this with some kind of legal measures. Since we're not hearing reports of like gay people being taken out and executed, even though it is illegal and considered a mortal sin and capital offense, then presumably that's not what's happening. Like, there aren't actually people being executed. It's just, you look the other way, people do their own thing, everything is fine. But the other possibility here is actually they are being executed, and it's so routine that nobody bothers to talk about it, or there aren't documents recording it, because, police action isn't a thing as far as, like, documenting or these things that are happening. Like, there are documented incidences of gay people being executed, but they're fairly few and far between, and most of them are occurring in the latter half of the medieval period, So what does that mean? Does that mean that everything's becoming more restrictive, or does that mean that it was tolerated beforehand, or is it not and nobody cares? Like, what is actually the deal here? And with such little information, so few sources to draw from, scholars are kind of left to come to their own conclusions, which means that there's a lot of controversy as people interpret this information different ways. Again, that's kind of the whole historiography discussion we're having here. Given that there are a whole bunch of gaps in our knowledge about what's going on between the 6th century AD and the 16th century AD, what do we do? How do we figure what's going on here? So, as far as I can tell, the Byzantine women are more liberated than the Justinian Code would suggest. Maybe there are homosexual communities among these spiritual brothers, but it's equally possible that that's not the case. Now, the trick to the Byzantine Empire is that it kind of has a really great couple of years there under Justinian, but its star falls pretty quickly. As Islam is growing in the wake of Muhammad's preachings and, the sort of formation of the Islamic faith, as the Islamic conquest is taking more and more territory, much of that territory is from the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire very much shrinks very, very quickly after the 6th century. They will never be as powerful as they were under Justinian. They will never have another shot at taking Rome. For the most part, they are going to be sort of like endangered on all sides. First by the Persians, like Khosrow, who present a threat to Justinian's empire. Then, as the Islamic conquest spreads, the Islamic world is going to take more and more territory from the Byzantines. And this leads us to the Orthodox Church and the sort of gradual schisms of the Orthodox Church throughout. As we talked about last time, the Orthodox Church kind of gets like pieces cut off of it over time. Some of that is because of the Islamic conquest. Some of that is because like a lot of these churches are actually pretty alienated from the center of the Orthodox worship. Like they're, people out in Egypt or people in Syria or people in Ethiopia kind of have a very different relationship to the church than, the Greek churches or the churches in Asia Minor. And consequently, like when Islam takes over much of the Byzantine world and sort of separates those churches from the sort of center of Orthodoxy in Constantinople, many of those churches are allowed to operate largely without any like oversight or, any sort of coercion to join Islam. And they do just fine, thank you very much. They didn't need, Constantinople looking over their shoulder. They're perfectly happy to exist with, the Islamic authorities looking over their shoulder. So these become separate churches in their own right as they sort of gradually or sort of dissociate from the church in Constantinople. So something like the Assyrian Orthodox Church, or like the Coptic Church in Egypt, or the Syriac Orthodox Church, all of these churches sort of separate from Constantinople at different times, and as a result have very different traditions. They all agree to the basic principles of Christianity, the stuff that was established in like the Council of Nicaea, or the councils that happened subsequently. But broadly speaking, they recognize different authorities. They've often worshipped different saints, or venerate different saints, I should say. There's very major distinctions between each branch of the Orthodox Church. And some of the most familiar, like, bastions of Orthodoxy, something like the Romanian or the Bulgarian or the Russian Orthodox Church, these are actually long-standing traditions founded by Orthodoxy after many of, their other churches have sort of been separated from them through the Islamic conquest. The Orthodox Church has a really interesting history, which I'm definitely not qualified to talk about very much. But I want you to understand that where the Roman Catholic Church is kind of one major thing for literally 1,000 years and change, the Orthodox Church has a complicated history of separation and reintegration. All of these Orthodox churches, all the ones that I've mentioned, have a sort of cordial relationship here in the 21st century. Maybe a strained relationship under some cases, certainly not a hierarchical relationship, like they do not all kowtow to, the church in Constantinople anymore. They recognize themselves as essentially equals in some respect, much as the patriarchies of old tended to work. But broadly speaking, these are not following the exact same traditions. The church in Constantinople cannot say to the Russian Orthodox Church, hey, you got to follow our rule because we were there first. The Russian Orthodox Church wouldn't listen to them. So it's messy is kind of what it comes down to. And recognize that as we sort of look at Orthodox theology going forward, or try and, understand how it works in relation to the other churches we're looking at. Because essentially this is kind of the last we're going to talk about Orthodoxy. There's probably much more to offer, but it's not something that I'm terribly knowledgeable about. I want to give you the context for what we're going to talk about in the future, and the fact is this is not going to be a whole lot of context for what we're talking about in the future. So know that it's a thing. If you have more questions about it or want to study it more deeply, by all means, you have my blessing and encouragement. Go learn more about what the Orthodox Church thinks about love, about marriage, about sexuality, about friendship, about, their own faith. But as far as we're concerned, yeah, this is kind of the last we're going to be seeing of the Orthodox Church for quite a while. Largely, the reason for this is because after the Renaissance, the Byzantine Empire very much falls apart. The Crusades are a complicated series of wars, and we're going to be returning to them often in our discussion here. They sort of mark the midpoint of the medieval world, and everything that goes on during the Crusades and afterwards is largely referred to as the late medieval period, or especially if you're adopting that Eurocentric view, the High Middle Ages, when Europe is actually figuring its shit out instead of just, wandering around and getting into fights with itself all the time. What I do want to stress is that many of the Crusades involve all three of the powers we're looking at today. They're usually incited by the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire working together, like saying, hey, we want to, go reconquer Jerusalem because it's a horrible shame that it is under the control of Islam and not under the control of Christendom. Usually this is at least partially motivated by the Byzantines being like, hey, the Muslims just stole more of our territory and we're really scared and we don't want them to take Constantinople. Can you give us some help, Christian to Christian? And usually the Christians are like, or the Christians in Catholicism are like, hey, yeah, we'll totally help you out. Here are a bunch of randomly assorted troops that we sent your way. By the way, they might not all be great people because, like, we told them that we'll give them automatic forgiveness if they join the war effort. And the Byzantines are like, cool, that's great. We're so excited that you gave us all the bad soldiers. We'll see what we can do here. And usually it's a giant mess. Like, we'll talk more about it once we get to the Catholic side of this discussion. But for the Byzantines, this is basically, please help us, please send troops. Usually the troops come in and, they help out in some way, and then, like, they're left to their own devices for another couple hundred years or whatever. But this very much comes to an end with the Fourth Crusade, because the Fourth Crusade is a giant mess. Like the other three, the Byzantines are like, hey, can you send somebody to help us out? And the Catholics are like, well, I don't know. We've been doing this for a long time now. Like, it's been 150 years. And also, we're not really into this whole conquest thing. Like, we took most of Spain back at this point, so we don't really care. Like, it's your problem now. And the Byzantines are like, hey, but seriously, Christian to Christian, can't you help us? And the Catholics are like, all right, fine, I guess. And they send, like, a hodgepodge of troops with very little organization. And they all show up in Constantinople, and they're like, hey, can you give us some orders? Like, let us into the city and feed us, maybe? And the Byzantines are like, you guys are the worst, and this is totally a violation of our treaty. You are not allowed inside of the city. Go take over some territory if you actually want to eat something. And the Crusaders are like, what? That is really screwed up and we're not happy about this, so we're just going to invade you instead. And they do. They invade Constantinople, they sack the city, it kind of really sucks. The Byzantines manage to get it back together again, but they're basically done as far as the medieval world is concerned. Within a couple hundred years, the Ottomans are going to show up, take over the entire Byzantine Empire, and that's it for the Byzantines. The Orthodox Church will endure under the Turkish rule, just as they endure under other Islamic rule. But broadly speaking, like, by the end of the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantines are done as far as the world stage of history are concerned. And this is going to set up a lot of fighting in the future, just so you know. But that brings us to the other side of the Roman Empire. Like, again, if the Byzantines represent one historical trajectory after the fall of Rome, obviously we have to talk about what's going on in Europe in the Western Roman Empire. And like I said, when Rome falls, it's going to kind of be the source of a lot of infighting for a long period of time. But what we didn't talk about is what happens to philosophy in that time. Like, we talked about Stoicism, we talked about how Stoicism influences the Roman world and kind of becomes the dominant philosophical perspective for the Romans. But when Rome falls, much of the learning and scholarship and philosophy falls along with it. Like, up until now, in Rome you could find lots of Greek speakers and lots of Latin speakers, lots of Greek philosophers that you could read and study, and lots of Latin philosophers that you could read and study. But after the fall of Rome, the Latin part of that discussion is much more prominent in Rome than was the Greek, and so for most of the medieval world, the Dark Ages as we usually call it, Europeans don't have access to the Greek texts. They can't study Plato and Aristotle. They can't actually read Homer in the original Greek. Like, they've got stories, and they've got summaries, usually from Latin sources, like Augustine, like the Vulgate, or the Latin Bible, like the Aeneid, or, the really important poem that the Romans wrote to talk about how awesome they are. But all of the stuff that they got from the Greeks is only known secondhand. Like, they only know Plato because they've got, like, one dialogue that's been translated into Latin, and also Augustine summarizes him a whole bunch of times. Like, this is not an exaggeration. This is all that the Europeans have of the old Greek culture from once upon a time. which is why scholars have referred to this as the Dark Ages, because much of the learning, much of the philosophy, much of the scholarship that was so common in the Roman world had been lost in the European world at this point. Now, the Byzantines are still speaking Greek, and they're still studying the Greek text, and they're still studying Greek philosophy. And as we'll see in a moment, Islam is doing the same. But here, where the Latin, language and culture was most powerful and influential, all the Greek stuff kind of falls away when Rome falls. And as, Europe is trying to rebuild itself, it really doesn't have a whole lot of guidance as far as how to do that. Not at this point, unless it is a pre-existing Latin text. So the power structure here ends up kind of dividing into three sections, which, further complicates our discussion on how to understand exactly what's going on in the medieval world. But there you go. We got three major political players: the Byzantines, the Roman Catholics, and the Muslims. But at the same time, like within Catholicism, you've got three major political forces that are shaping the way that the Catholic world is understood. Obviously, the first one we need to talk about is the papacy, the clergy. So the Roman Catholic Church continues to exist as probably the most powerful power structure in Europe at this point. Like, again, when the Gothic tribes come in and take over Rome, they break the back of the European Roman power structure, but they do respect the Christian authorities, and they still listen to the bishop in Rome and regard him as the most powerful spiritual authority in the area. And as the Roman Christians kind of get really excited about this, they once again trace their authority all the way back to Peter, and that time that Jesus said, "Hey Peter, you are going to be the rock on which I found my church. You're in charge of the whole thing," which Roman Catholics interpret to mean the Roman Church, or the Church in Rome, is the central authority of the entire world. Every Christian church has to listen to us because we descended from Peter, like pope to pope, all throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. And since Peter was the primary authority, that makes us the primary authority. So this even includes secular power. Like, as much as, you would think, okay, so the church does its thing, but the kings do theirs. Yes and no, because the papacy can totally say, like, if the king in England is misbehaving or not, giving them proper authority, or they're doing something that disagrees with church doctrine, the church can be like, okay, we excommunicate you and all of your people. At which point the people are like, what? We're not going to heaven because King Edward's a jerk? Well, we gotta change this. And usually now King Edward has to go, put down a bunch of rebellions and, make peace with the Catholic Church and, do something to make everybody happy, like sign a really potentially damning document. All this means that the Pope actually has a whole lot of political power. The European kings and lords have to listen to him because otherwise he can excommunicate them, and that can make life really, really difficult for them. And since the Pope now is the most powerful man in Europe, obviously there are a lot of people who want to be Pope all of a sudden. And you'll notice, this is a replication of, the actual tablet that exists in St. Peter's Basilica that lists the long lineage of the Roman popes. And you'll notice if you look pretty closely at it that there are a couple of weird things going on here. First, you'll notice that there's a giant gap between Victor I and Leo I. Apparently Victor I ran the show for something like 270 years. This represents a period of time where the bishop in Rome was not documented, and therefore they can't necessarily trace, successor to successor all the way from Peter to Leo I. But Leo I is himself kind of a big deal because he's the pope who's in charge as Rome is falling. And the story goes that, at one point Attila the Hun showed up at, Rome's doorstep and was like, I'm going to take over Rome now because that's what I do. And Leo I apparently went out, had a conversation with him, none of which survives. And Attila the Hun, apparently just turned around and left, which is pretty dang impressive if you ask me, but, whatever. At any rate, this is largely when the unbroken line of succession can really be traced. But you also notice that, through the 6th century and the 7th century and the 8th century, there are a lot of names, often divided by only a couple of years. Like, even all the way through the 10th century, you can see, like, okay, so Johann the 14th took over in 984, and then was immediately displaced by Johann the 15th in 996, who was immediately displaced by Gregorius the 5th in 999. Like, these guys are only running the show for a couple of years. Like, look over here in the 9th century. Formosus apparently takes the throne in 896, is taken over by Bonifacius the 6th in 896. Oops. Stephanus the 7th takes over literally next year in 897, replaced immediately by Romanus in 897, and then Theodorus II in 897. Yeah, so because the papacy is now the most powerful, like, position in all of Europe, the popes are now going real Game of Thrones here in the 9th and 10th century. They're assassinating each other, they're poisoning each other, they're like bumping each other off in order to take over the throne. I should also stress that at this point the papacy doesn't regard celibacy as essential to the clergy. So like popes are having kids and then naming their kids the next pope. Yeah, it's a giant stinking mess. And as a consequence, the other sort of power structures and authorities are getting a little, like, involved and more complicated here. So in the 9th century especially, the papacy realizes that, hey, like, Italy is not necessarily a safe place to be, and since we are, like, the primary authority in Europe, we can basically declare the Roman Empire a thing again. So they do. In 800, they name Charlemagne, Charles the Great, as being the first Holy Roman Emperor. Like, hey guys, it's the Roman Empire, but better because the Christian Church is in charge. And as much as this seems to be working for a pretty good amount of time, like Charlemagne does manage to like put down all the people who disagree with the Pope and unify basically Western Europe into one like empire for you know the Pope and their sort of secular authorities to rule. Charlemagne's descendants kind of turn on the church pretty quickly, and now we've got a secular power structure and a religious power structure, and they're often at odds with each other, and it's often not clear who is supposed to be in charge at any given time, and, you know, part of all of those assassinations might very well be orchestrated by secular authorities. Oops. So now we've got the Roman Empire, or the Roman Catholic Church, inheriting the, you know, religious authority, but now we've also got the Holy Roman Empire, which is supposedly under the control of the Roman Church, but not really. It's more complicated than that. And to further complicate things, the other kind of major source of, or center of learning and power is actually the monasteries and the monks. There have been Christian monks for as long as there's been Christians, essentially. Like, as early as the 1st and 2nd century, you can hear about Christians just wandering off into the desert to, like, practice their faith without any interruption. And among those 2nd and 3rd century Christians was Saint Benedict, who basically said, okay, like, I'm glad that everyone is taking their faith so seriously, but maybe we need to, like, organize this a little bit better. Like, maybe a whole bunch of people just starving to death out in the wilderness isn't such a great way to practice Christianity. So he founds these monastic orders which start to crop up all over the Christian world. Like throughout northern Africa, throughout Western Europe, there are all these monasteries where Christians like get together and like separate themselves from the rest of society, but at the same time, like they have power and authority, and especially they have books and literacy. So they are studying the ancient texts, they are studying the Bible, they are reproducing the Bible, which is going to be really important later. They are, you know, reproducing the works of great theologians like Lactantius or Augustine or Boetius. They are basically centers of knowledge, and because these monasteries tend to have estates, usually donated to them by local lords as part of their tribute, the tithe that the Roman Church expects of these lords, these monasteries actually become fairly powerful and influential. They can govern whole swaths of territory. They usually have, like, regular people farming the land for them, and oftentimes like they start to become like trading centers in their own right when they start producing beer or wine. Yeah, this is a thing. Christians were all about drinking once upon a time. I know it's weird to think about that now, but it is what it is. And additionally, the monks start to have increasing sway over the clergy as well, to the point that in the 13th century they actually get like an ex-monk made pope, and then there's all these reforms and all these changes, and, you know, this is where the papacy becomes like, oh, now you have to be celibate, and, you know, popes aren't allowed to have sex, and neither are priests. It's messy, it's complicated, it's interesting, it's especially useful for us to talk about, because, again, as philosophers, just about any time you read a scholar of philosophy in the medieval world, it's almost certainly some monk in some monastery somewhere writing about, you know, what he thinks that Christianity should look like at this particular day and age. All that to say, like, the monks are a big deal here. They are very influential, they are very literate, they are very scholarly, and our guy Andreas Capellanos, who you're reading this week for our discussion of courtly love, is absolutely one of these monks trying to understand this secular phenomenon in a religious context. But I also want to stress, just as the spiritual brothers in the Orthodox Church are often sort of like assumed by contemporary scholars to be sort of like state-approved places where homosexuality can exist, yeah, the monasteries too. All these dudes hanging around, like, with no sexual outlet. So homosexuality is a documented phenomenon in many of these monasteries. That is not to say that the monasteries approve of it. More often than not, you're going to find these monasteries and abbots trying to fight homosexuality and like the monks themselves sort of disciplining themselves and trying to control their own sexual urges. But it's messy and complicated. Different people interpret this stuff different ways. So keep that in mind, that this might very well be an outlet for homosexual activity. Now, as far as the family is concerned, this is where things get really tricky and messy. Because on the one hand, again, much like the Byzantines, the medieval world in Europe is trying to figure out how to do family and how to do marriage and how to do sexuality under, like, the Augustinian very restrictive laws, as well as trying to figure out, like, okay, so how is family supposed to work under God here? And especially given that most of these lords and kingships are passed on by the family line, it gets more and more complicated all the time. So on paper, the rules of, like, marriage and family and treatment of women are all basically just what does it say in the Bible. Essentially, the local priest and other authorities are trying to enforce biblical teaching as much as possible. So, like the Byzantines, divorce is therefore outlawed. There's like no room for divorce unless, you know, something really, really weird or bad is going on. Like divorce is allowed for kings in certain situations if they cannot, you know, impregnate their wife. But otherwise, it is strictly forbidden. But this is another one of those cases where there are loopholes in the enforcement at the end of the day that are actually kind of super fascinating. So part of the whole marriage and divorce and, you know, legal state of the family laws as exist in the medieval world have to do a lot with this idea called consanguinity, i.e., like, you've got these elaborate family trees where the various relationships to the individual person are laid out in painstaking detail because it's very important that, A, your bloodline be preserved. Like, if you are the son of a king, then you've got to be able to, like, trace, I am the son of a king. But also, like, you can't commit incest, obviously. That is strictly forbidden. Like, the Bible is very angry about this. The Roman Empire and Roman law was very angry about this. And as much as possible, the priests and the lords are trying to follow Roman law and teaching. But this is where it gets kind of interesting, because the Roman law said, hey, you are not allowed to marry someone who is within 4 degrees of you. But the Roman method of calculating degree was to go up your family tree and then across. So, like, 4 degrees meant you count 1 to your parents, 2 to your grandparents, 3 to your aunts and uncles, and 4 to your first cousins. So you're not allowed to marry anyone in this little triangle, effectively. You're not allowed to marry your father or mother. You're not allowed to marry your grandfather or grandmother. You're not allowed to marry your aunts or uncles. You're not allowed to marry your cousins, or even your or anyone that, like, was, you know, anyone who your aunt or uncle brought into this world. But everyone else is okay. So, like, second cousins, fair game. Third cousins, fair game. Like, if you are, you know, marrying the daughter of your cousins, that's fine. I know this sounds weird to us. Give it a moment. We'll get there. But this was the way that it was all understood. But then the church authorities were like, okay, that's a little too liberal, and we want to, like, actually be under God's leadership here, so we're going to increase that number from 4 to 7. So now we're going to go up and we're going to be like, okay, so not your mother and father, not your grandmother and grandfather, not your great-grandmother or great-grandfather, or indeed anyone that they have, like, brought into the world. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Everyone in this triangle is now completely off limits to you. But, and this is where it gets fun, shortly after the sort of we're going to do this by 7 degrees thing came into force, a rival interpretation of degree came about, largely because the Germanic, like the Gothic method of calculating degree, was not this triangular, okay, you go up your line and then you go back down, but they just did it straight up side to side. And if you do that, then that means that 1 degree is your cousins, 2 degrees is your second cousins, 3 degrees are your third cousins, and so on and so forth. And as long as you're doing 4 degrees, that's fine. Like, that means you're not marrying anyone up to your 4th cousins, which is pretty dang safe. We're honestly less, like, weird about this. Like, you can marry your 4th cousins in this country without anybody, like, thinking that that's super weird, because essentially you're related only by your great-great-great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. But now, once it's 7 degrees, well, that means, like, that's everyone, according to the Germans. Like, literally everyone on this family tree. If you are the person in the center, then your 7th cousin is not allowed to marry you. The child of your not great-grandfather, but your great-great-great-great-grandfather, they are all off limits. And because the idea of lineage is a little vague here in the medieval world, like, many people are forging their own understanding of their nobility. Like, frequently, if you are like a middle-class farmer who has just made it big for some reason or another because you've got the ear of your lord or whatever, like, you'll just come out of the woodworks and be like, hey, I found this mysterious long-lost document that says that I'm actually the child of royalty. It turns out I'm a peer of the realm. How convenient. And actually, you got the whole thing forged by someone who just knows how to write and nobody, like, authenticates the stuff, so it's like, okay, fine. As a result, divorce is actually really common in the medieval world, because it's really easy to point to your family tree and be like, oh, it turns out my wife is actually related to me. We both have the same great-great-great-grandfather. And everyone's like, okay, sure, fine, your marriage is a null that never happened. This whole thing was, an abomination before God, but, these things happen. It was an accident. How are you supposed to know? So consequently, people are getting divorces left and right. But they're doing it because of this complicated legal loophole, because not everyone understands the consequences of the laws that are being passed. So the consanguinity law, as much as it is supposedly about incest, can actually be used pretty conveniently to justify pretty much any divorce, because it is simply too dang rigorous. So this means that, again, like, the medieval world has laws, has rules, but you can't necessarily take them as authoritative for the way that people actually lived. The truth of the matter is that, yes, women are not given a whole lot of rights. It's probably more restrictive than it was under Rome, for sure. But it doesn't change the fact that divorces are entirely possible, especially if your wife happens to be well-connected. But that means at the end of the day that men have more power because they can play the system more effectively, and money has more power. So if you are a poor woman, you are definitely going to be at the butt of all of these systems. You will be married because it is convenient, and you will be divorced because it is convenient, and you will have no say over what happens to you. Which, if you're a rich woman, then you can use the same thing to your advantage against your poor husband, so I guess that's egalitarianism, ? But it means that the systems are not aligned along gender lines, they are aligned along power, authority, and, like, wealth lines. It is effectively anarchy where whoever is the richest and, can most effectively snow everybody else wins, in some sense. So that's a bit of a mess. Now, that said, after the, since what we talked about with the Dark Ages, like, since the Greek language had disappeared, since, all of the Greek laws and ideas had kind of, like, been transposed into their Roman counterparts, and that was now the authority, I should stress that by the end of the Middle Ages, again, with the Crusades, because the Roman Catholic world was coming into more contact with the Islamic world, like, the wars themselves were not conducive necessarily to, like, fraternizing with people of different beliefs, and it doesn't change the fact that both Catholic Christians and Muslims consider each other to be heretics, but gradually the two are having a lot more, conversation with one another. As a result of the First Crusade, like, as much as Jerusalem is in fact conquered by the Roman Catholics, who knew? What a surprise. Like, this really is just shocking to everybody involved because the whole thing is so dang disorganized. But the Crusaders do in fact take over decent amounts of territory in the Holy Land and build the Crusader states there. And as much as you might think, okay, so they're going to do Catholicism over there, and the Pope is... No, the Pope doesn't have any authority over the Crusader states. In theory, they are Christian. In theory, they are listening to the Pope. In actuality, these are usually mercenaries, basically just like deciding whatever they want to do themselves. And that usually means trading and engaging with the Muslim neighbors pretty regularly. Now, likewise, over in Spain, there's kind of a messy, complicated business. Islam had taken over much of Spain as early as like the 6th and 7th centuries, and had basically just sat there until the first couple of Crusades. But by the 11th century, the Catholics are pushing them back, taking over formerly Muslim territories, but not bothering to kick out the Muslim influence. That won't happen until considerably later on in history, like 15th, 16th century. That's kind of what the Inquisition is all about, in addition to persecuting Jews and Protestants, and it's a mess. Suffice it to say that there's a lot of conversation, a lot of trade going on between the Arab world and between the Catholic world, and as we get into the 11th and 12th centuries, that trade just increases. And as a consequence of this, the Arabs, who have actually been really interested in the Greek philosophers and Greek philosophy, gradually reintroduce Greek texts back into circulation in the Roman Catholic world. So you'll find increasing numbers of philosophers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th and 14th centuries looking at Plato and Aristotle and reintroducing it to Christendom, sort of talking about these ideas, often filtered through Muslim scholarship, like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, two of the great scholars of the 11th century. Now that said, the Crusades themselves do not breed a whole lot of friendship between the two cultures. Catholicism and Islam are kind of frequently at odds with each other, even as their relationships are getting friendlier over time. The First Crusade, again, is kind of just the Catholics showing up and taking over territory in order to sort of bring Jerusalem back into the fold, and, it's a shame that Christendom can't, visit Jerusalem on pilgrimage. By the Second Crusade, they're basically just reinforcing the states that are already in existence, but after the Second Crusade, the Islamic world very much has this very powerful general by the name of Saladin, who manages to take over much of what the Crusaders have conquered. And he is, shockingly benevolent and generous to the Christians, to the point that even the Christians regard him as being actually a really cool dude. But this kicks off the Third Crusade, which is kind of the big one for Roman Catholicism. This is where we get the band back together, and, not only are we sending, the disorganized little bands of crusaders who are all just mercenaries, basically, trying to get out of hell free, but now we're sending, actual kings and leaders, the Holy Roman Emperor himself goes on the Third Crusade, but the whole thing is a giant nightmare. The Emperor drowns because of a, stupid accident right off the bat, and King Richard of England is, captured on his way back home, retreating from Muslim territory. So this very much, sours the whole Catholic world on Crusades altogether, especially because there are increasing, transactions and, more people are talking to Muslims and more peace exists between the Catholic world and the Muslim world. So all that to say, that's part of the reason why the Fourth Crusade ends as badly as it does, with the Byzantines kind of getting the short end of the stick here. But that does bring us to this new era of scholarship and learning and wisdom, this new era of trade and ideas between Catholicism and Islam. But that brings us to our third major political entity here. What's going on in the Islamic world? Because, again, you've probably heard about, the Roman Catholic world in the medieval era, from your world history textbooks, so much as that's a thing here. I know that nowadays in New Jersey, at least, it seems like the only high school education you get about the world history beyond what is going on in America is maybe 1 year in high school, maybe. That's how it was when I was in school, and my understanding is it's only gotten worse since then. At any rate, what I want to stress is Islam is not the villain of this story, not by a long shot. Medieval or depictions of the medieval world usually lean on the idea that Islam is the villain, that the Muslim invaders to Europe are a constant threat, and that the Crusades are these heroic enterprises to push back the tide of Islamic rule. This is nonsense, and Eurocentric nonsense, and xenophobic nonsense, and straight-up racist nonsense in many cases. And I want to spend all the time I can pushing back these bad ideas, especially because Islamophobia is so current nowadays. What I want to stress is that the Islamic world is in fact the great empire of the medieval ages. And honestly, if you think about it, and I mean, just look at the map, this is the greatest empire that we've talked about yet. Like, Alexander the Great went on his world tour from Greece and managed to take over, like, basically everything on the eastern half of the Islamic conquest map. He conquered Egypt, he conquered the Arabian Peninsula, he conquered Persia, he made it all the way to the Indus River in India, and then he stopped. So he controlled a large part of the empire that Islam controls. But the Mediterranean world is kind of ignored by him. He is a land warrior. He is, disinterested in, spending lots of effort sending people overseas. The Roman Empire, by contrast, takes over basically the entire Mediterranean world, but never gets as far as Persia or, the Arabian Peninsula. Like, they take over much of Egypt, but only really the northern coast of Africa. Islam, by contrast, takes over the whole shebang. Their empire stretches from western Spain to the Indus River and even beyond in some cases, what we would call Pakistan today. It includes not just the entire Arabian Peninsula, but spreads deep south into Africa. And as much as you can see, like, there are other kingdoms and political entities here, the spread of Islam, the religion, actually is far beyond what is depicted here. Islamic scholars and explorers and missionaries went far down the Nile River, went deep into sub-Saharan Africa, and you will find Muslim populations throughout sub-Saharan Africa to this day. I've hung out with some of them. But all that to say that, like, somehow this gets ignored in our textbooks, again, because of Islamophobia or whatever you want to explain it as, because, the only world events that we're interested in are the ones that Christians do, apparently. But what I want to stress is this is an impressive political and military accomplishment. Now, this is a little misleading. This is not an empire the same way that the Roman Empire was, with its one center of, authority. In fact, this is a much more complicated history of empire building. That Muhammad in his own time, after sort of writing the Quran and, expanding, the reach of his religion, does manage to take over much of the Arabian Peninsula, but it is his successors who expand the empire to the whole of the Arabian Peninsula and then grow even farther. Much of the Islamic world here, shortly after the 7th and 8th centuries, will in fact sort of degenerate into smaller caliphates and smaller empires in their own right, often with, their own rivalries among other Islamic nations, just the same way that Alexander's empire fell apart, just the same way as the Roman Empire eventually fell apart. It lacks the social cohesion that the Roman Empire had, and certainly lacks the chronological duration of the Roman Empire insofar as it is coherent. But I want to stress that Islamic rule in one form or another is really fascinating stuff. And it is really egalitarian in ways that you might not expect. So, to sort of walk this back a bit, let's talk about the Quran for a moment. Because, again, you can't talk about Islam without talking about the foundational document of Islam, the Quran. And the relationship that Islam has to the Quran is kind of different from the way that Christendom relates to the Bible in many ways. According to Islamic history, Muhammad, showed up in the 6th and 7th centuries and claimed that he had received a vision from God, a revelation. A personal revelation. Like the Archangel Gabriel came to Muhammad and said, take this down, I have the last word of God to all of God's people, and you have to record it because you are God's chosen prophet to deliver this message to the world. So Muhammad writes it all down, and again, unlike the Bible, it is word for word the revelation that God gives him. Like, the Archangel Gabriel dictates, and Muhammad takes down notes. Like, the Bible doesn't work like this. We've probably talked about it at this point, but the Bible is all about, okay, so, God talks to the prophet, and then the prophet, paraphrases what God says. Sometimes he takes dictation verbatim, something like the laws of Moses and Exodus and Leviticus, but more often than not, it is okay, so God told me to tell you that we're not gonna, divorce anymore, and everyone's like, oh, okay. Or God told me to tell you that the first commandment is, you will have no other gods before him. And it's kind of ambiguous whether like this is word for word what God said, or whether this is a translation, or whether this is like Moses paraphrasing. At any rate, Moses is the prophet, so we listen to him because he's got the ear of God. Most biblical scholars in both Judaism and Christianity, from what I understand, recognize that most books of the Bible are inspired by God, like God breathed is the image here, but they are all at least partially determined by the individual writer's own style and approach. That doesn't mean that it isn't authoritative. If anything, Christians frequently lean on it is all the more authoritative because it is all that we have of God, but it is a very different relationship from, the Quran's God said this literally in Arabic, Muhammad took it down, and therefore you can trust it 100% and absolutely. Now, Muhammad's own story is a complicated one. He starts preaching the Quran and the truth of Islam, the submission to God in Mecca, but he's kind of like run out of Mecca when nobody believes him, so he goes to Medina, which is apparently much more willing to listen to what he has to say, at which point he sort of conquers Mecca by force. The business of the Quran is not as violent as you might think. It preaches peace. It says that you need to, convert by, persuasion, and that it is also very friendly to Jewish and Christian beliefs, which is why so many Christian and Jewish communities peacefully coexist within Muslim-ruled territory. But at the same time, the Quran does lay out a lot of theocratic organization. Rule by Islam is not the same as rule by Christianity, where Christianity kind of sometimes takes it or leaves it. Okay, so you listen to the Pope because the Pope said so, but he, your king is the only secular authority you need to worry about, and he is only submitting to Christianity insofar as his faith is concerned. Islam is a little different. Islam insists that, actually the laws need to be laid out according to these passages, according to these teachings, according to what Muhammad did in his own time. It's messy, it's complicated. I don't want to get too deep into it. For now, let's just suffice it to say that Islam is every bit as rooted in faith as the other traditions we've talked about, Christianity and Judaism. Islam actually sees itself as the last word on both Judaism and Christianity. Islam recognizes Christ as an important prophet and spiritual leader. Islam recognizes the Old Testament and the Bible as being an important source for religious revelation, but this is the last word. The Quran is more authoritative because it is the last thing that God said. God may have changed some things from the earlier documents, or maybe they were imperfect in some respect. Therefore, listen to the Quran first, and then maybe read your Bible afterwards. Now, that said, once again, we end up in the territory of, okay, so what about the law versus the interpretation of the law? Just because it says a thing doesn't mean that it's necessarily practiced the same way. And I should stress, Islam has some pretty interesting cultural developments over the course of medieval history that do not seem to align with the way that Islam tends to be portrayed today. So, for example, this guy Abu Nuwas, he is a poet, an Arabic poet in the 8th century. He writes gorgeous poetry that has been largely preserved to this day, much of which is written on pederastic and homosexual themes, much of which is written about how awesome wine is, which many Islamic cultures will later get really, really upset with the idea of drinking in general. The Quran is more ambiguous, but also generally frowns upon excessive drinking. So I want to stress, if Abu Nuwas is able to write and circulate his poetry, that seems to indicate that there seems to be a certain amount of tolerance of homosexuality in the Islamic world, despite the statements of the Quran and other and the Hadith to the contrary. But that doesn't mean that it also was completely tolerated. It's complicated. We're not entirely sure what the silence means here. And this would be the logical point for me to talk about, okay, so how are women treated? What is marriage like? All that stuff. I got nothing for you on that one. And this is a complicated topic for a number of reasons. One is that it's definitely not my area of expertise, and trying to find sources on the subject is really difficult. I did, in fact, try and look it up in order to prepare for this discussion, and I did, in fact, find a book on the subject of women in Islam, and I don't have access to the book at the moment. I am working on it. But everything that I'm seeing and all the research I'm doing indicates that this is kind of an open question. Nobody really knows what the standard was for marriage in the medieval Islamic world. Like, the scholars that I found don't have a lot to say on the subject, and the one paper I found on the topic was basically like, yep, nobody knows. Here are some examples of stuff that was going on, but all of this is subject to debate, and everyone's still in the middle of a lot of controversy, and there doesn't seem to be an authoritative source on the subject. At least not yet. This is further complicated by the fact that I'm doing my research in English because I can't read Arabic, and if there is a lot of information about this topic, it's probably in Arabic. But this is also complicated by the fact that most Arabic sources nowadays and most Arabic scholars nowadays are working under a much more conservative understanding of Islam than might have been the case back in the medieval world, which means they probably are going to be coloring their scholarship as a consequence. A totally unbiased attitude just does not exist here. And that is even further complicated by the fact that, like I said, this is not one Islamic empire with one Islamic set of laws, the way that we saw with Rome or the Justinian Code. Instead, we are seeing lots of different rulers, lots of different caliphs over a long period of time, often changing their perspectives as time goes on. So one of the examples that I did find that was fairly well documented was the Fatimid Empire in Egypt. And one of the most noteworthy legal changes that occur in the 11th and 12th centuries, if I'm not mistaken, might have been the 13th, is that there are a whole bunch of laws passed down by a particularly conservative ruler that forbid women from going in public and insist on them dressing more conservatively, all of which indicates that they weren't doing that beforehand, that this was a problem that needed to be addressed, and probably was only perceived as a problem by this particular ruler. So this indicates that, like everything else we've talked about, there was probably a certain amount of liberality allowed. Women were probably not dressed as conservatively as they are in Muslim nations today. But it doesn't change the fact that this is all speculation. That it could be that they were in fact dressed conservatively and they fell off of that and this was an effort to correct, or that this leader was in fact reflecting ideas that were already common at the time, just codified. It's complicated, is what I want to say. And consequently, I can't give you the thesis on, okay, so what are Muslim women treated like? We have, like, as much of my information is coming from the likes of, Ibn Sina and Ibn Hazm as anywhere else, and consequently, you're reading those texts and you can come to your own conclusions as well. There isn't necessarily an authority on this. Again, feel free to do some research. I'd strongly encourage it if this fascinates you or you want to dig deeper into what these scholars have to say. For now, though, I want to stress that as much as, we have a lot of questions about what the Islamic world looked like on a day-to-day level, we actually can see a lot of really cool stuff coming from the Islamic world as far as their scholarship is concerned. The Islamic world was largely rich, powerful, and there was a lot of rich people with a lot of leisure time on their hands. And many of them devoted their lives to scholarship. They loved Plato and Aristotle. They loved studying the ancient Greek thinkers. They loved adapting the ideas that had been found there and loved building on them. So many Islamic philosophers throughout the 9th through 13th centuries do some really impressive work. And beyond this, among some of our all-stars here are Ibn Sina, the guy that we're reading his philosophy of love. He is frequently Romanized as Avicenna. This is how Thomas Aquinas refers to him. Avicenna is a great Aristotelian scholar, and he is frequently commenting on and adapting his own Aristotle's thinking to Muslim teaching, much as the Christian philosophers of the time are very interested in sort of adapting Greek and Roman philosophy and making it correspond to biblical teaching. So is Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd trying to adapt Aristotelian and Platonic thinking to accommodate the Quran and its teaching. So Ibn Sina is processing Aristotle through the lens of God. And what he comes up with is his thoughts on love, which is basically Aristotle's on the soul with God and the Islamic understanding of God as the fundamental, giver of love, giver of purpose, much like Aristotle's own prime mover. Ibn Rushd, often referred to as the commentator by Thomas Aquinas, is the guy who's sort of weighing in on Ibn Sina, if I'm not mistaken, and building on what he has to say. And our third guy over here, who I haven't had much to say about, Al-Ghazali, I'm definitely mentioning him just because I like him a lot. He honestly doesn't have much to say as far as the system of philosophy as it's kind of being built by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, because he's very much a skeptic and very much out to destroy it. Al-Ghazali is sort of prefiguring the likes of someone like David Hume, or probably more accurately, someone like Malebranche in the 14th and 15th centuries in Europe. Al-Ghazali is convinced that philosophy is a pointless discipline because God is in control of everything at all times, and the only reason that we think that everything is consistent is because God has decided it so. So stop asking silly questions and stop making up systems, because God will change it whenever he darn well pleases. The reason your, pen falls to the ground when you drop it isn't because, there's a force of gravity or some sort of scientific law. It does that because God literally pulls it to the ground personally, and we should not see him as doing anything else, which I think is super cool. At any rate, this also gives rise to Islamic science. Again, science is very much co-opted by the Western world. The word itself is not really coined until, the 16th, 17th centuries. We'll talk about it when we get to it. But I want to stress that, as much as, usually your history book will talk about, hey, the Renaissance and the printing press enabled science to happen, and you got, Brunelleschi building new buildings, and you've got, Galileo looking at the... Yeah, they did not do this from whole cloth. Galileo definitely copied the ideas of Islamic inventors. The telescope had been invented by Islamic scholars long before Galileo modified and improved upon the model. To this day, we are still using the same Islamic numerical system and algebraic system that the Islamic scholars used. The basic numerals we use, 1, 2, 3, etc., they are Arabic numerals. That's what numbers look like in Arabic at this time as well. So Islam accomplishes all of these impressive things and then passes them to the Western Roman world. This does not come out of whole cloth. Galileo was not the first scientist ever. There were lots of scientists, and Galileo just gets credit for it because he's the first European and therefore the only one that we care about. But I want to stress, math, science, all of these things are improving dramatically during this period because of Islamic work, because of these Islamic scholars, because of, again, middle-class Islamic tradesmen who are, spending their spare time writing and reading books and creating new avenues for learning and study. But obviously, this story also ends with the Crusades. Not ends in the sense that, it destroys the empire the way that the Byzantines are destroyed, but it does change things. The Islamic world is going to persist long after the Crusades. Again, the Fourth Crusade doesn't even do anything to Islam for the most part. But the Islamic world is going to shift and sort of disintegrate in many ways following the Crusades. We'll see the Turks and the Ottoman Empire come about. We'll see the division of the different sort of empires and political entities in northern Africa. Much of these are still unified by faith, but they are not unified in the same way by political organization anymore. But again, this is a sort of area of study that I am still working on and building on rather than able to be speaking authoritatively about today. For now, what I want to stress is when we talk about love in the Roman Catholic world, when we talk about the European world and the European of understanding of love going forward, I want to stress that it is thoroughly influenced by Islam. Ibn Sina and Ibn Hazm share similar assumptions about the way love works, even though they are coming at it from two radically different perspectives. Ibn Sina is a philosopher. He is studying Aristotle and he is examining love through the lens of Aristotle. He is trying to codify it and trying to systematize it. Ibn Hazm is a poet. He is just recording what he observes. But both of them have in common this Islamic understanding of love that embraces this idea that love is good for you, that it ennobles you, that it makes you a better person. Just like the Greeks did, and just like many of the Romans before the Stoics did. Remember that Western Catholicism has a largely Stoic-influenced understanding of love, that Augustine very much takes the Bible and what it has to say, which may itself have been influenced by Stoicism, and adds Stoicism to it. So we end up with a view of love that is very negative, that sees sexuality as something sinful and tempting. But Islam understands sexuality as being something positive and uplifting, something that makes us better people. Like, yes, Ibn Sina has a pretty low idea of the sexual act. He's like, hey, you should totally embrace people, and you should totally kiss people, but you shouldn't be having sex with them because that is what animals do. Like, yes, have sex for the sake of progeny and procreation, but other than that, like, it's probably not something that you should be, like, chasing around a lot. But Ibn Hazm, he doesn't have such negative perspectives on it. He's like, yeah, people throw away their lives for love all the time, and it's kind of awesome when they do. Like, it's not great. It usually ends in their downfall, sure. Like, I'm not denying that, but it's still powerful and it still feels good, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But what both of them kind of emphasize is this idea of distance. That falling in love with a person is perfectly fine so long as you don't act on it sexually. And the Catholic world picks up on this. It changes it in some dramatic ways, but all of our medieval romances, our stories of Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot, largely are informed by this Islamic notion of love, where by being in love you become a better, stronger, more courageous person, but by being in love you should be hesitant to express that and instead just feel your feelings, love from a distance, admire and appreciate beauty without necessarily succumbing to it. And I want to stress that there is a direct connection here. And this idea of love as ennobling and also as dangerous, this idea of love as fatal and powerful and beautiful, we're going to see this come back a lot. Like, we're going to study this in greater detail when we look at Andreas Capellanus in the next lecture, so definitely watch out for that. Like, you'll see, we'll talk about how Ibn Sina and Andreas Capellanus sort of like take cues from one another. But at the same time, you'll notice that in the modern European history, this idea is going to haunt us. It is, in many ways, not a Christian idea. Like, Augustine would not tolerate Lancelot and Guinevere as being some kind of, adulterous role model for nobility and chivalry. This would be repugnant to him, like we'll talk about with Capellanus. But it doesn't change the fact that it does inform a lot of art and literature of the time, and that is going to get carried into the future and into the present. So all of that is, at least in part, indebted to Islam and their understanding of philosophy, of science, of literature, of poetry, of love, in some respect. We are all one Western world. We are all taking cues from each other, and if I traced it out enough, I suspect I could find, ideas found in Islamic understanding of love as far east as Hinduism and even Chinese philosophy. It's there to be found if you want to. This is not a distinctly Western phenomenon, this philosophy of love and friendship. And what we understand as West should be broadened to include the Islamic world, the Byzantine world, and beyond. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Recognize that everything that we're talking about in this class has greater context if you're going to dig deep enough to find it. And I encourage you to do that. Start looking for answers to the questions that I don't necessarily have answers for. And if you find questions that I haven't asked, feel free to answer them yourself. Don't settle for my take on history here. It is pretty narrow and pretty incomplete. So going forward, we're going to talk about how courtly love works. We're going to talk about how that sort of influences Christianity and whether or not Christianity can bear this sort of influence. And we will follow that into the future, discussing the modern world and beyond. But that's our discussion for next time, and I look forward to talking about it with you soon.